Policy Exchange is hosting a series of podcasts on Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and the wider consequences of that. I'm Michael Mosbacher, and today we've got Air Marshal Edward Stringer with us, who was the former Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff. Edward, first question: is this crisis Britain had planned for? Had there been sort of considerations that something like this might happen?
I think you'd have to say yes and no. Specifically planned for, probably not. Hard to know how you would.
Yeah.
But in the general sense of preparing people for it, understanding the situation on the ground, helping Ukraine, then I think it's fair to say we've got a pretty good track record there since 2015, under a thing called Operational Orbital, where we've continuously had a smallish team, up to 100 people, training the Ukrainian armed forces. But I think the figures now, I tried to check them the other day, but I think there were about 22,000 Ukrainian servicemen of one description or another have been through that training. So to the extent of being concerned about further Russian incursions into Ukraine, yes. But actively wargaming or exercising, difficult, given how would you wargame for what we've seen of the sanctions package at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Putin's nuclear threats, which he's made sort of more and more belligerent nuclear threats. Is it just sabre rattling, or should we take those seriously?
Both.
Both.
Well, he's sabre rattling to the extent that I think he's indicating weakness in this conventional operation, and people have mentioned his nuclear threats. I think there were actually three, because in the big exercise that was conducted well before this special military operation, you might remember it finished with Putin himself going down and supervising a big exercise of the launch of rocket forces, which could be nuclear weapons, and then there are the two explicit threats afterwards. So to an extent, he's reminding the world that Russia is a nuclear power. So you could say it's just sabre rattling because we do have the theories of nuclear deterrence, and we have a very strong, sophisticated Western and NATO strategic nuclear deterrent. But you do have to take it seriously, because Russian doctrine has always seen certainly low yield, what you might call battlefield nuclear weapons, as things that are there to be used. In contrast, the West has tended to take a different position, which is these are terrifying weapons, terrible weapons of last resort, to be used as the nuclear deterrent. So the West has tended to have some internal arguments over questions such as no first use or sole purpose, which have been in the headlines recently in the last couple of years. But Russian doctrine is discussing how you might use them to psychologically shock and stun the opposition, and that sometimes gets known as escalate to de-escalate. And I think we do need to have a very good understanding of that framework of thinking that the Russian High Command has.
In a comment piece you wrote for Policy Exchange last week, you set out precisely these points about the different approach of the Russian nuclear deterrence and the British nuclear deterrence, and how Russia's precisely seen nuclear war fighting as a real possibility and has used battleground nuclear weapons. What scenario would we escalate to that situation? I mean, what would happen? Why would Russia launch battlefield weapons? Because they thought they were losing, or they'd...
Russian doctrine emphasises firepower just as much, probably more, than manoeuvre, and it needs to maintain momentum in its plans. And so I've given you one scenario, which is if it felt it needed to dominate the political discussion, if you like, concentrate minds in the most terrifying way, what better way than to use one or two battlefield nuclear weapons, which are still terrifying and terrible, on what might be seen as an exclusively military target. One might wonder at a surface action group of ships at sea, for example. But the worrying side of that doctrine is and something certainly I used to write about in the old job. You have to hope that and plan for deterrence working, to stop them going in the first place. Because if momentum stalls, Russian doctrine calls for ever heavier firepower to allow it to keep the steamroller moving.
For people who are not so familiar with this, what's the consequence of launching a battlefield nuclear weapon? I mean, what's the explosion? What does it do? I mean, how destructive are they?
Well, think of a slightly smaller Hiroshima. You've got to remember, it's still a nuclear weapon. As I say, We've always taken the view that you cross the nuclear threshold when you use any nuclear weapon, and it is the sort of thing that you could use to just obliterate an airfield, for example. So think on it in that level, because many of them will be fired with short-range rockets, and during the Cold War, you even had small tactical nuclear weapons that could be fired by artillery. So you're talking the range there of tens of miles, and clearly the people who fired it have to be safe at those ranges. But yes, if you think about a large airfield would be wiped out by one of these things, and then there would obviously be hideous damage in the few miles surrounding that.
And under NATO doctrine, if Russia launched such a weapon outside of NATO, if it launched it within Ukraine, what will the NATO response be? Or there isn't a clear view on that?
Well, NATO always maintains a position of strategic ambiguity. But if you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has concentrated minds and produced some almost overnight policy changes, which are quite staggering, are they not, in the last week, then if anybody was to use nuclear weapons on mainland Europe, then we are in an entirely different world with an entirely different level of political calculations.
Thanks. In the piece you wrote for Policy Exchange, you sort of mentioned the point that Britain's only got one part of its armoury in nuclear weapons, purely the Trident deterrent. So the only scenario under which Britain would use nuclear weapons is in either sort of cataclysmic. It's only a deterrent force, and that we'd only use it if there was a direct threat. It's the final option. Do you think Britain needs to reconsider its spread of do we need more of a nuclear deterrent than just Trident, or do we need to have more options?
My thinking on that was really more about the defensive element, and it was to say that we mustn't lull ourselves into a false sense of security and thinking because we have a very competent and significant strategic nuclear deterrent that somehow we have removed the nuclear question in toto. And all I was saying is there is a different framework of thinking on the other side of this particular confrontation. And so I merely point out that therefore we have rather failed to train a generation of commanders into thinking how they might face a nuclear threat. And there's two elements of that, of course. There's the equipment you need. The services when I joined, we all had our Cold War packs ready to go. We had our respirators. We had our nuclear, biological and chemical kits ready to put on. We assumed that the Soviet Union, as it was then, would use these things. And that position has just slowly drifted away, if you like, with the end of history, post-1989, the concentration on counterinsurgency campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you like, we have allowed the nuclear question to become, well, it's okay, we've still got the continuous at-sea deterrent, and without ever really formally stating it, our revealed position would seem to be, and because we're deterring all nuclear weapons, we'll continue with the continuous at-sea deterrent, and then we can concentrate on being good at conventional warfare. And I was merely pointing out that our commanders, who might be in command of international forces, Joint Expeditionary Force, for example, may well find themselves on the other side of a border looking at a Russian commander who has got these weapons.
In the Cold War, we had a wider range of deterrents, did we? Did the UK have other?
Yeah, during the Cold War, we did.
Yeah.
And it went up and down as you went through, even down to land force rockets, Lance, etc., etc. But until relatively late, we still had some form of triad. They weren't necessarily battlefield weapons, but the Royal Air Force still had the 177, the nuclear bomb. So we could come up with a more graduated response. And there were some maritime weapons as well. But those have all been removed from our infantry quite a while ago now. And so we have the continuous at-sea deterrent.
We had the integrated review last year. In light of what's happened and Russia's invasion, does that need to be do we need to go back to that and review it, or are we happy with where we stand?
There's a lot in the press about this at the moment, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I think it's really quite dangerous because, to my view, the counter integrated review charge is quite seductive. It's intuitive, and I think it's wrong. And we probably need a whole new podcast to go into why. At the simplest level, I would argue that the modernisation agenda has rather been proved over recent conflicts, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, where we've seen Syria, certainly Western Syria, where we've seen extensive uses of drones, especially some of the Turkish ones, which they've exported quite widely. And we've seen armoured forces being taken apart by those. So just because the Russians have now launched what looked like a tank war in Western Europe doesn't mean we have to go symmetrical and start investing in huge numbers of tanks. Those are the things that are being bogged down and are being taken apart now by drones and by some very sophisticated American and Anglo-Swedish light anti-tank weapons. So I think the modernisation agenda, even on the battlefield, is really being rather reinforced. So the fact that Russia will invade a very large country like Ukraine has, of course, changed everything. Is there a case for spending more on defence? Yes, but not for going back to the Cold War and trying to rebuild the forces as they were then, to slug it out symmetrically with Russian armed forces in the mud. I don't think that case is made. Secondly, if you think more strategically and look back at what the integrated review said, and I think I just have 2 points on this. The first is those that criticise the integrated review are actually setting up a bit of a straw man and misreading it, because no one ever said that the future of warfare will all be about drones and it'll all be fought in cyberspace. What it's saying is cyberspace and space are now contested warfighting domains in a way they weren't before. It doesn't say, and you don't need major battle-winning equipment in land, maritime and air as well. And indeed, the integrated review makes it clear. And indeed, the defence has got an extra 16.5 billion on the back of the case made by those that wrote the integrated review, that it needs to modernise, and indeed it needs to be able to still contribute battle-winning forces in air, land and maritime to NATO. And the final point I'd make, and I think this is the grand geostrategic point, at the heart of the integrated review, and I think it's fair to say now the team who wrote it might have gone a little bit further in what they would have said, but the market wouldn't bear it at the time. So the integrated review talks about China becoming a systemic competitor. I think what we're seeing with Russia now is that those mythical Russian armed forces that were 10 foot tall, that would sweep through Ukraine and immediately start threatening Poland, the Baltics, don't look as strong as we thought. The Ukrainian annual defence budget is about $5.5 billion. It's about a tenth of what the UK's is, and look what the Ukraine is managing to do with that. So if you're an actuary and you're looking at the risk here, and you look at the 1.2 trillion annual defence spend across NATO, would you conclude you have to spend much greater amounts of money now to defend against Russia, which has just shot its bolt?
Yeah. See that part.
But the integrated review talked about the pivot to China. So if I was around the US presidents at the moment, I think what I might be saying is the Europeans, just from their statements, nothing, I won't make anything up. I mean, look what Olaf Scholz has said. The Europeans are now going to be spending more on defence. Therefore, the Europeans will be taking care of their backyard, given what we've now seen about the actual Russian capability. And therefore, it looks like the pivot to the Indo-Pacific region looks ever more possible, from that perspective. So my plea is, yes, take the macro lesson here, that the world is more dangerous, but don't knee-jerk to symmetric responses. Think through now from, if you like, the grand strategic position set out in the integrated review, where we should place that effort, given, as was always said, Russia's an acute military threat, but it's not really changing the geopolitical weather as such, but China is altering the climate and therefore needs a much firmer response from us across the board. So sum all that up, and I went and reread the integrated review the other day to make sure I wasn't suffering from sort of false memory syndrome. But I think it really does stand up on rereading.
Okay, thanks. Now moving on to more specifics. There's been talk of a no-fly zone. I take it that's an impossibility because of Russia's having a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be tantamount to starting war with Russia. Would it? Or is there a way of having a no-fly zone?
Well, it's not impossible to do. As you've seen, technically, I think most NATO air commanders would now conclude it would be easier to do than they had imagined. But you have to look at the ramifications of a no-fly zone, and I suspect some commentators, with the best of motives, might still be rather wishing that a no-fly zone is, if you like, something that's akin to air policing. We gently push people out and we prevent them using it. No, a no-fly zone is an all-up air battle that you wage to achieve the air dominance, and that's what a no-fly zone is. You are dominating the airspace to the extent that you can mandate who does and doesn't fly and use it. So that's why I've always said it is an act of war, and it's not just other aeroplanes that you're keeping out. Clearly, that's what you want to achieve, but you need to remove all an opposition systems for controlling or helping to control the airspace. So those are radar sites, surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and that's why...
So it would be NATO forces bombing Russian...
Yeah, so that's why all the no-fly zones I've been involved in, most of the other air forces realised flying was pretty suicidal, but you could lay what were called SAM bushes, an ambush with a surface-to-air missile. And so, not quite daily, but weekly, there would be operations to take down enemy air defence systems to sanitise the airspace and make it safe. So this is definitely you taking on, in this case, the Russian military to win the air battle. Now, can that be done? Yes. Is it an act of war? I would say so. Should we be deterred by Putin is a political question. I certainly don't sign up to this idea we've got at the moment that people are only not doing it because Putin's declared it an act of war, and therefore he declared sanctions an act of war, and we're still carrying on with that. This is much more really to do with thinking about the NATO alliance. After all, the decision not to operate a no-fly zone over Ukraine was taken a long time ago. The nations who've signed up have all signed up to Article 5, and if they are attacked, it's all for one. They haven't necessarily signed up to follow the bigger powers into a war against Russia. And if you, over Ukraine, where the bulk now of Russia's combat power is deployed, and you remove its aircraft from the skies, prevent them from flying, and you attack a lot of its ground equipment, you are essentially declaring a war on Russia, at which point NATO is involved in a war with Russia. And I think I would consider what that would mean very carefully if I was a Baltic state that shared a frontier.
And we're going back to the nuclear issue.
Or a Scandinavian state that shared a frontier with Russia. And we're going back to the nuclear issue. And this is clearly why the politicians have thought long and hard, and why in all their statements, having talked about the no-fly zone or not, the second one is to point out they will defend vigorously every single square inch of NATO territory. That is what is in the contract, and to show we stick by the contract, that is what we have to say we will do, and that is what we will have to do.
Ukraine is very keen to get its hands on planes. There was this talk of this Polish deal, which seems now to be going nowhere, but Poland handing over some of its Russian Soviet-era planes to Ukraine and then getting more American planes in return. What's your view of that? Would a Ukrainian Air Force make a real difference? And is there any way that can be achieved, that Ukraine can be supplied with planes at rapid notice?
Yes, I think fundamentally all of those are the right thing to do. Of course, there's nuance attached to all of that. First off, can the Ukrainian Air Force make use of these aircraft? And it's much more tricky than to say, have you got a pilot who can climb in and fly it? It's pretty much got to be the same type of aircraft that they currently operate. Have they got spares for it? And if you think two aircraft are the same, well, we used to fly the Harrier in the Royal Air Force and the Sea Harrier in the Navy, and I think the only thing that was compatible between the two was the tyre on the front wheel. So have they got the spares? Can they maintain it? Are the aircraft systems things the pilots know? I should think with a relatively simple aircraft like the MiG-29, the answer to that is yes. If I could link the two questions to an extent, at the moment, is a no-fly zone an absolute necessity? Well, it seems there's a slight increase in Russian activity at the moment, but it would seem to me that the Ukrainians are making just as much good use of the airspace, as the Russians. And so bolstering their capacity with these aircraft such as the MiG-29, I think is very sensible, and they will be able to make use of it. But I'd also make sure that we send to them all the things they need to control the air, which are things like man-portable air defence systems, or Stinger, and more of the drones, which have been really effective. And there are reports that the Turks, have done just that. So I think bolstering their air force is absolutely the right thing to do. And as I say, I would hazard a guess that a no-fly zone, and if you set it up as a no-fly zone, then no one flies. A no-fly zone, you could argue, would hinder some of the Ukrainian operations now. And in the future, if, as what we're seeing, the balance of effectiveness on the battlefield continues to swing against a rather bogged down Russian military.
With a no-fly zone, you said there's a very real risk that this could escalate things. Russia would see it as an act of war, and there's the real risk that NATO gets attacked. It becomes a conflict between NATO and Russia. With supplying planes to the Ukrainian Air Force, is that a risk, or much less of one?
Well, I don't think it is. In the sense of that whole question of act of war, has NATO tripped over some line? I don't think it does, and this is the area where you have to, I would argue, maintain some political resolve. The Russian narrative could so easily take NATO aircraft flying close to the Russian border and shooting at and downing Russian aircraft is absolutely clearly NATO fighting Russia. It's hard to get away from that. But supplying them with the material that we always have is us sticking with, as I mentioned before, the plan that we always had. So I don't think we should be deterred by any of the Russian pronouncements on this, because I think those are genuinely just sabre rattling. Once again, political decision.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Edward Stringer for those interesting comments. This is part of a series of podcasts that Policy Exchange is producing on Russia's invasion in the Ukraine. We've had Benjamin Judah, we've got Edward Stringer with a whole lot more planned, and subscribe and listen.